And welcome to the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy. This is our 5th annual Robertson Lecture. So welcome, we're happy to be able to host it here on this beautiful day today. And the title of our lecture is Canada in the Age of Electricity, featuring a keynote presentation by Dr. Blake Shaffer, Associate Professor of Economics, University of Calgary, followed by a commentary from Dr. Brett Dolter, Associate Professor at Department of Economics, University of Regina, and Dr. Margot Hurlbert, Canada Research Chair in Climate Change, Energy and Sustainability Policy at JSGS. So she's one of our esteemed professors here. So we're very proud of Margot. Happy to hear her in conversation today, this afternoon. So I hope you're all excited and ready to go. My name is Danette Starblanket. I come from Starblanket Cree Nation. I'm an assistant professor here at Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy here at the U of R campus. I'm part of the Robertson Lecture Planning Committee, along with several others, which I'll speak about later. And I'm honored to be your MC for today. This is such an important topic for us, given the geopolitical challenges that we're facing here in Canada, in Saskatchewan, and as, of course, as from my perspective as Indigenous peoples as well, from that Indigenous perspective. So all those challenges that we face as a country and the impacts that it's going to have on us, that these challenges will have on us, particularly in the areas of policy, make us really excited to be able to be here and listen to you today. So I'm sure we're going to have lots of questions in those regards, particularly in the area of looking at our situation, what's happening here in Saskatchewan. I'd like to acknowledge that while today's event is taking place here in Regina, and it's also online, JSGS's physical home here is located in Treaty 4 and Treaty 6, because we do have our campus at USask as well in Saskatchewan. So the original lands of the Cree, Saulteaux, Ojibwa, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and of course, traditional homeland of the Métis peoples. We're glad to welcome those of you joining us today from across Turtle Island and make this acknowledgement as an act of reconciliation and gratitude to those whose territory we reside on or who are here visiting. I encourage you to take a moment to think about and express gratitude for the place and space that you occupy and for the people who have been the stewards of it throughout time, since time immemorial. Let's pause for a moment to take a minute to think about what we can do to actively engage in reconciliation to honor the land and the First Peoples. Thank you. Knowing that we have guests joining us from across the country, I'd be remiss if I did not say a few brief remarks about our event host, the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy, or JSGS. JSGS is a national hub for advanced study and research in public policy and administration, with campuses both at the U of S, U of Saskatchewan, and University of Regina. JSGS's graduate and executive development programs build knowledge, skills, and competencies for success in government, nonprofits, cooperatives, and credit unions. Nationally, we're recognized for our professional training and research excellence. JSGS is responding to the needs of public sector partners, including First Nations, Métis and Inuit organizations and institutions, governments and communities who are confronting economic, social, and environmental impacts and issues. One of JSGS's research areas that speaks to me, and likely many of you joining us today for the Robertson Lecture, is the school's focus on science and innovation policy. Scientific knowledge, when properly and clearly shared with policymakers and the media, can greatly improve the quality of the human experience. It's critical that the findings scientists make through rigorous discipline and proven protocols are not misinterpreted or misunderstood in order to preserve the integrity of scientific leadership, public policy, and communications work. It was this line of thinking that led to the creation of the Robertson Lecture series. So I just want to now at this point give you some housekeeping, some logistical details for those of you who particularly are in the room and have not been here with us on campus. And if so, then we hope we see you again at many of our lectures that we hold. But for those of you here, if you need to exit, you've got the 2 doors there, right on the front and the back of the room. The emergency exits can be found at the a marked stairwell at the end of the hall here. We kindly ask that all attendees ensure their cell phones are muted right now, if possible, because we do have quite a number online. If you have a question for our speakers during the Q&A, please raise your hand and we will call on you. The mics will pick you up. We've got mics up top. If you have a question for the speaker, for those of you joining online, for the speakers, if you have questions, please email it to jsgs.events@uregina.ca with the subject of Robertson Lecture question, and we will pose the question on your behalf. Our wonderful colleague at the back will send it up through technology up to our wonderful colleague at the front, and she'll get it real quickly. Okay, just like that, just on the spot. All right, if you have any logistical issues during today's presentation, please don't hesitate to send a message to the same address, email jsgs.events@uregina.ca. So that's for those who are online. The format for today's event is, after opening remarks, our speaker, Dr. Blake Shaffer, will deliver a presentation of approximately 40 minutes. Dr. Brett Dolter and Dr. Margot Hurlbert will offer comments and questions about what has been presented. Finally, we'll open the floor to the audience Q&A. When asking questions, please keep them concise and focused so our speakers can address as many as possible. With that now, I'd like to welcome my colleague, Dr. Margot Hurlbert, to provide a few welcome remarks.
Great, thank you, Danette. I am just going to do 2 things. I'm going to give you a little background on the lecture series and Dr. Bev Robertson, and then I'm going to introduce our speaker, so I'll be brief. So thank you for attending, everyone. The Robertson Lecture is made possible by a generous donation from the late Dr. Bev Robertson and his wife Elaine and their family. Dr. Robertson was recruited to the University of Regina's physics department in 1969 to work on automated X-ray diffractometer and was involved in the development of crystallographic software before retiring in 1997. He was later conferred as a professor emeritus in 2003, deeply involved in establishing the University of Regina as a standalone academic institution than simply another extension of the University of Saskatchewan. His tireless work and diplomacy was essential for the fruition of the Saskatchewan Science Centre. In addition to his academic career, he's known and loved for being the owner and establisher of Bushwhacker Brewing Company, Ltd. In 2014, he gifted $500,000 to the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School to assist with the creation of the Center for the Study of Science and Innovation Policy and the establishment of the Robertson Student Fellowships, which support graduate student research in the area of science and public policy, and this Robertson Lecture. So I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge our past and current Robertson scholars, some of who are with us today online, and recognize the hard work and research that make their contributions possible. These 16 scholars have strengthened the depth and quality of research in their fields with impacts that will continue and unfold over time. So round of applause for our sponsor. Okay. I now have the honor of introducing our 2026 Robertson Lecture speaker. I'm very excited to bring to you Dr. Blake Shaffer, an associate professor of economics at the University of Calgary and co-director of Canada's Energy Modeling Hub. Prior to academia, Dr. Shaffer had a 15-year career in energy trading, specializing in electricity, natural gas, and emissions markets. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Calgary, a master's in economics from the University of Cambridge, and a bachelor's degree in environmental sciences from Queen's University. I think we are in for an engaging discussion, and I will turn over the floor to Dr. Blake Shaffer.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that, Margot, and thank you, Danette, for that great opening acknowledgement. It's a real honor to be asked to be here today. It's wonderful to be here. This is my first time in Regina, and I am no longer going to believe the tall tales of winters that you have here. As any good empiricist, I'm going to believe this is what it always is here. So thank you very much. Today, they gave me carte blanche in terms of topic, and I thought, well, I really like talking about electricity, so that's clearly going to be something. And what I thought I would do is maybe contextualize some really dramatic changes that are going on all around the world. I think it's fair to say we get a little myopic, a little focused on what's going on in our backyard, or us Canadians tend to focus a little bit too much on what's going on perhaps in the United States and lose sight of maybe what's going on globally. So I thought I'd provide a bit of a lens to what we're seeing around the world and then bring it home to Canada's place in that. So my talk is titled Canada in the Age of Electricity. And that term, Age of Electricity, was really coined by the IEA, the International Energy Agency, about a year ago, where in their World Energy Outlook, they put forth this rather provocative statement saying, in energy history, we've had the age of coal, the age of oil, and we're now moving at speed into the age of electricity. They followed that up this past year in their latest World Energy Outlook saying, we're not just moving into it, we're there. We're in the age of electricity. So what do they mean by that? There's sort of two dimensions when we talk about what does it mean to be in an age of electricity. The first is on the supply side. Supply side is changing dramatically. The share of clean electricity globally is increasing at a dramatic rate. We have our hydro, there's been a resurgence in nuclear, wind and solar have been growing dramatically around the world. We're starting to see some phase out of non-sequestered coal, looking at that as gas, and in general, a reduction in power sector emissions. This is an area where Canada has a really big starting point, really big leading advantage. Roughly 80% of Canada's electricity comes from zero-emitting sources. That's nationally, and of course, we know electricity systems are not national, and it differs greatly, and we'll look at that today. But as a country, we have a really big edge over a global average that's around 40% clean. The second dimension is more electrification. And this is where we're seeing the really dramatic changes. So what it means really is using more electricity in terms of the share of final energy demand. This is coming about from electrification of the transportation sector, electrification of heating, and increasingly electrification of industrial processes. This is an area where Canada, despite its strength in terms of its electricity grid, we're probably middle of the pack globally. It's an area where there's lots of opportunities, lots of challenges, but lots of opportunities for growth. If we look around the world, just a select few countries here. Here's our percentage clean in terms of electricity supply. And there you see Canada near the top of the pack there, sitting at around 80%. If you squint and look closely, the last few years, you see a decline in Canada. That might sort of counter a narrative. We've heard about the phase out of coal in Alberta, where I'm from, the growth of wind and solar. That really speaks to just how reliant we are on hydropower in this country. And what you're seeing there, that downturn, is the droughts that they've had in Manitoba, in British Columbia, and in Quebec over the last few years. So all three provinces, historically major power exporters, have been importing power for the past few years. Also speaks to the risk exposure, the reliance that we have on hydrologic risk, which is changing along with climate change. You see France really up there near the top of the pack, certainly in terms of major industrialized nations. That comes about from their dominance in terms of nuclear power. Germany increasing dramatically. That was a big push towards solar power. Of course, came as and wind power. And I think the notable one I wanted to point out on here, and we'll come back to this, is China. Okay, so you can see China, historically a real laggard when it comes to clean electricity, having a dramatic rise where they're now at that global average, okay, the pace of this. And this stops this series, I think, where I got all these ones ends in 2024. That's continuing and even more dramatically in this last year. The other dimension, percentage of electricity and final energy demand, so how electrified are we? There's a couple things to point out on this graph. First, Canada is sort of middle of the pack, and you're seeing those sort of mature economies pretty flatlined in terms of how electrified we are. So despite talk of electric vehicles, perhaps heat pumps, we're not seeing dramatic growth in the major economies there. But China really stands out. And this one, I apologize, some of these data, when I wanted to have consistent data across countries, they're not as recent as I would have liked. This is 2023. As of 2025, China is now over 30% of their final energy demand is coming from electricity. There's no other country that's really electrifying as fast as China. India as well, you don't see it on this chart, they look like a laggard, but again, in the last year, you're really seeing an upturn in India. And what's interesting about India is there was a recent chart out by a consultancy called Ember that I really quite liked. It was a ternary chart, so a triangle. And it showed, historically, our energy systems were reliant on biomass, and then increasingly we moved towards fossil fuels, and now we're starting to turn towards electricity in our final share of energy demand. India is making that turn early. They're not moving all the way through to a full fossil fuel like Canada, United States, where we're now moving towards more electricity. They're making that turn much earlier. So it's almost like the analog would be countries that bypass the landline and cell phones. They're moving to an electrified economy before fully moving off of biofuels. This is my attempt to put those two dimensions on one chart. I don't know if it speaks to you, but I enjoyed making it. You can see a few things on here if you stare at it closely enough. The open dot is where we were in 2000, and the solid dot is where we moved to in 2024. First thing I want to point out is that all of these major countries are moving from bottom left to top right. And that really is what the age of electricity is all about, is moving to the top right of that graph. Increasingly clean, increasingly electrified. You see Canada at the sort of upper area of that chart, speaking to how clean it is. Yes, moving left to right, but not so dramatically. You see Germany going clean very quickly, more so than they're electrifying. But really the one that I want to point to is what's happening again in China. So they are moving up that ladder in terms of getting percentage clean, but it's that dramatic shift to the right. Like I said, they're taking electrification quite seriously in China. If we look into Canada, and I hate talking about national figures. I'm an advisor, I should point, I'm an advisor for the federal government, advisor for province of Alberta, province of British Columbia, and whenever the feds talk numbers in terms of national figures, I recoil because we don't have a national electricity system. So here I want to go into the provinces and really point out the differences, because it is challenging if we talk about national targets and don't recognize those. So here's a version of percentage clean, but just this is almost the inverse of this. This is how much tons of emissions we produce when we produce a megawatt hour of electricity. And I've got it for 2005 and 2023. So a few things you'll see on this graph. One, the bars for British Columbia, Manitoba, Quebec, Newfoundland, Labrador are non-existent. They really emit very little because of their hydro dominance. Then you'll see the fossil provinces. The first thing to point out is just how dramatic they've fallen. Okay, so I think this is quite a success story. In Alberta, we've gone from a system where in 2005, over 80% of our electricity was from coal power. Okay, so coal power would be around 1,000 on that axis. Where now our system is primarily natural gas, but an increasing share of wind and solar. Okay, and you see that in terms of our emission intensity. You see Nova Scotia coming down. You see Sask moving down, but not as quickly. Okay, so Sask is now taking up that mantle currently of having the highest emission intensity of any province in Canada. In terms of electrification, again, really diverse across our provinces. So this is the share of final energy demand that comes directly from electricity. So we have a national average of around 24%. British Columbia sitting right on that. Big divergences. So if you look at Quebec, 45% of their final energy demand comes directly from electricity. Okay? In large part, this is, they have cheap electricity, so they found a way to use it. They have electrified industrial processes. The biggest share is really because they have electric heating in Quebec. If you look at the other end of the spectrum, Alberta and Saskatchewan, where electricity makes up a very small or almost insignificant, in the case of Alberta, share of our final energy demand, where natural gas really is dominant. Okay, so those national figures we see in Canada, it's always worth looking deeper into our provinces when we set policies, just how different we are nationally, and a lot of it stems from the resources, the different resources we have across the country. So what's driving these big changes? What's driving the push for percentage clean globally? What's driving electrification? And I really just want to point to two high-level things. So climate policies and falling technology costs. So starting with climate policies, I didn't know what chart to put up there, what figure to put up for climate policies. So I went with global temperature averages. Okay, and here you're just seeing that rise in global temperature average over the past century. Okay. As a result, we have seen a big increase in climate policies globally, certainly in Canada, certainly over the last 10 years, we've seen a real rise. I think it's arguable in terms of the push, in terms of what we've seen in that percentage clean, that it's really arising directly from those climate policies. Okay, to the extent to which they've been binding, no doubt at some margin they've had a push. But I think the real driver, and I think it's probably also fair to say indirectly from climate policies, has just been the dramatic fall in technology costs. Okay, a big part of that, of course, arising from incentives to do so. But this is what's driving percentage clean. You're not seeing China increase its share of solar and wind build. I think last year in China, they had twice the amount of solar installed as any other country, as the rest of the world combined. That's not coming about because they're necessarily their desire for climate action. It's simply economic for them. So look at these cost reductions. I have to remind myself of how big these are, and I study this day in, day out. 99.6% reduction in the cost of a solar PV module. So around when I was born, I'm cheating a little bit, but close to it, was that $36 per watt. Now it's 10 cents per watt for a solar module. So things that weren't deemed realistic or possible, or certainly not economic, have shifted very, very quickly. And we're beyond that tipping point where economics dictate that this is now a feasible solution. Similar in wind, and of most importance is what we're seeing right now in batteries. Okay, so battery technology costs falling so quickly has implications for the supply side of our grids, but it also has implications for how we use electricity, specifically EV costs. Okay, electrification of transportation directly falls out of those battery cell price reductions. So cheaper tech, more deployment. So in terms of solar and wind, you see this just explosive growth in terms of the capacity of solar and wind on global electricity systems. And you're seeing some divergence in trends. So the mature markets, while they lead in share of generation coming from wind and solar at this point in time, the growth path for China, the growth path for emerging markets is accelerating faster than the mature markets. Some of that's natural. We reach a saturation point where the marginal value of adding more wind and solar gets less. But really what you're seeing in China, and I think this chart ends in 2024. So by 2025, they're now pretty much at the same level as the rest of the world. Okay? And you're also seeing the emerging markets bypass other forms of generation and go directly to solar and wind, where it's happening much more cheaply. Electric vehicles, again, a story of different worlds here. So China really is the story when it comes to electric vehicles. They're now over 50% of their vehicle sales are electric. They're now the biggest market for electric vehicles. They're now exporting their electric vehicles. As we know, some are going to come to Canada. We've lumped North America and Europe here together, which is unfortunate because there's a real divergence. Europe's still growing. We now have over 50% of vehicle sales last year in Europe were electric, if I include plug-in hybrids. Whereas in North America, we actually fell last year. So the US and Canada declined in their sales. And this is, again, one of these things where if I think about electric vehicles trajectory, I think it's pretty easy to, as a North American, as someone in Alberta, to really think, well, this is not going to go anywhere. But then you look around the rest of the world, and they're beyond the tipping point. Okay, there's no going back in China. It's just simply cheaper. Here we are at a point where when you take into account the lower operating cost of electric vehicles and you amortize that over some reasonable lifespan, it's a reasonable proposition to go electric. We have the challenge of cold weather and what that means for range here in Canada with electric vehicles. We still have charging network infancy, so there's definitely some obstacles. But in China, they're past many of these barriers. So that 50% is going to be effectively 100% within about 5 years. Okay? And we're going to see that more and more as we pass the tipping point because battery technology is getting cheaper. Charging networks are only growing, they're not reducing. And the cold weather issue is also being resolved with battery technologies too.
And today.
What's that?
And today.
And today. So climate change has a reinforcing factor of making it a bit easier to work on it. In terms of grid scale batteries, this is something where if you're thinking about integrating wind and solar, and I'm going to come back to that, you have to manage that intermittency. This is an area where we're seeing dramatic growth. So in Margot's opening remarks, I was an electricity trader. I was actually head trader of TransAlta, which is Alberta's largest power company. There was no batteries when I was a trader. Now we have about 100 megawatts of batteries in Alberta's grid, which has 20,000 megawatts of capacity. But you're seeing this growth. So what are those numbers there? 200 gigawatt hours of battery capacity globally, and just massive growth in terms of battery deployment. California has a system is about 40,000 megawatts, and recently they were dispatching close to 20,000 megawatts from batteries. Okay, there was none when I was trading less than 10 years ago. So that's all coming about from the need arising from more variability on the system with wind and solar, but also just the cost of it being cheaper that now makes sense to deploy. Returning to China, I know it's a focus, but it is such a big market, and I think the common story of China is that, we always hear, why should Canada do anything related to climate change? Why does it matter when China is going to continue to not do anything? And that narrative really can't continue, because that's not the story anymore. We are now the laggards. Okay, the US certainly, but we are the laggards. China is now leading when it comes to deployment of clean technology, specifically when it comes to electricity. So here's cumulative installed solar capacity on the left and wind capacity on the right, and you can see China has almost as much solar and wind installed as the rest of the world combined. And if you look at the slope of those lines, that's how much they're installing every year. If you squint and you try to do some derivatives from your calculus days, you would note that China installed twice as much solar last year as the entire rest of the world. Okay? Similarly, on wind, they did more. I don't know if you heard Trump at Davos said China likes building windmills, but they don't have any in their country. That couldn't be more incorrect. Okay, they are the absolute leader when it comes to this. And China is embracing electricity. So this one goes a little bit further. You can see we're now at that 30% mark that I mentioned, whereas North America and Europe are sitting in this 20 to 25% range. And that growth in electricity, again, when you think about China's position right now, where do they want to be reliant on importing fossil fuels, of which they have no control over, and increasingly there's threats. The places they go to get that supply from Venezuela suddenly shut out from them. Or do they want to have it under their control, where they have critical minerals, where they have the solar panel manufacturing, they have the battery manufacturing. This isn't a climate change story that they're doing all of this. This is just pure economics and energy security. We'll probably come back to Saskatchewan at some point, and you have an energy security strategy. You as well here are looking at the resources that you have under your purview. We can discuss that, but China is looking at that, and that's why they're recognizing that electricity is where they can be in the control of their future, and they can be dominant. And for them, economically, it's the cheapest option. I have to say something negative, so you don't think I'm just a cheerleader for what's going on in their country. Still a long ways to go. Okay, so while they're growing that wind and solar, which is at the top of that chart, the green and yellow, coal still is the dominant electricity source. So as they electrify, it's still worth noting that the lion's share of that electricity is still coming from coal plants. Okay, and they are still building coal capacity. Every year you'll hear that they're adding coal capacity, but what's interesting is because of the growth of wind and solar, the capacity factors, which is think of that as the percentage of time they're using those plants, is falling faster than the capacity they're adding. So they're actually producing less energy from coal power last year than they did the year before, despite adding more capacity. So they're building new coal plants and then running them 30 to 40% of the time. Okay, and we can get into the specifics of why that is, but the most important thing for emissions is how much are these being run, not are they being built. And last year was the first year, I think, outside the COVID year, first year in 40 years, where both China and India reduced their coal generation. The US increased their coal generation. Globally, we were still down, though, because of China and India. So let's come back to Canada. What are our advantages and disadvantages in a world that's going electric? First off, on the supply side, vast part of our country already mostly clean electricity, but of course that differs greatly across the country. We do have control over and access to key critical minerals, which are increasingly going to be in demand as we go forward. We have this tremendous flexibility. So I don't think of large hydro as a great energy source anymore. I think of the flexibility that it provides. Okay, we'll talk about transmission and connecting the provinces later, but that's going to be critical for Canada to leverage energy sources that we have, for example, in Saskatchewan and Alberta, with flexibility resources we have with their neighboring provinces. And we have experience with nuclear. Okay, while it's not dominant in Ontario, it's a significant share. We have experience, and I'd be remiss here in Saskatchewan if I didn't mention we have the resources required. On the disadvantage, so high latitude, the rest of the world, the dominant source of electricity generation will be solar and batteries as we move forward. It's just going to be the cheapest source. They're both getting cheaper. But for Canada, it may not be the case, in large part because of our high latitude. Okay, the seasonality of that production. So even here, well, today's a nice sunny day, but southern Saskatchewan, southern Alberta are the best resources in Canada for solar. It's actually reasonably economic, but that seasonality where the production from a solar plant might be around 10% of its capacity in the winter and 40% in the summer, that's really challenging to manage from a grid perspective, that long-term seasonality. Whereas when you think about more equatorial places and even just the United States, where you don't have as strong a seasonality, you can manage the diurnal or daily nature of solar with the current battery tech. Our cold weather, challenging for current EV range or electrification, but again, I think that's very temporary. That is changing pretty quickly. And lastly, I don't know if this is a disadvantage, but cheap alternatives. I think disadvantage is a bit unfair, but it's harder to make the transition when your alternatives are as cheap as they are. We have near unlimited natural gas in Alberta with lifting costs under $2 a gigajoule. It's really hard to compete with that when you have that plentiful. Set aside just the political reality and of incumbency there, but the economics of it versus other places where natural gas alternatives are 4 or 5 times that. So pathways going forward, how are we going to move forward? Often this gets divided into 2 camps. I don't think that's necessary, but we do often think of this as 2 different camps or views. One is the clean, firm technology, where nuclear plays a central role. And Saskatchewan has chosen that path in their energy security strategy recently. And they are in sync with a rising wave in terms of favorability towards nuclear. Okay, it ebbs and flows. We saw a near low point after the Fukushima disaster, but now it's rising where the majority of folks are actually supportive of nuclear again. On the other side, the other pathway that we're going to see in lots of places is renewables plus some form of flexibility. And this chart is 2025 year-on-year change. Okay, and just to point out, this is the path that's happening globally. So globally, 75% of all growth in electricity came from solar last year. Roughly 100% came from solar and wind. And you see a marginal increase in nuclear and a marginal decline in coal. But solar, chiefly solar, but solar plus wind are really dominating the story globally. Okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit about renewables. I don't know if the conversation is as heightened here, as polarized as it is in my home province. But if you mention, I go around sometimes to rural council meetings. They ask me to talk about electricity because they have projects coming in, and this gets very heated at council debates. So I try to bring a bit of a measured discussion around renewables, and let's try to do that here today. The pros towards it. Why do we even talk about wind and solar? Chiefly, they don't emit greenhouse gases during production. Like any energy source, there's emissions in the production of the facilities, but during production, you've got that clean energy. Once built, near zero marginal cost or operating cost. So that tends to depress generation prices or wholesale prices. Most importantly, the reason why they're now in the conversation is capital cost is falling. So these are like levelized costs. I'll give you a sense of the cost. And you can see solar was about $400 a decade ago, $400 per megawatt hour. And now we're into the realm where in Alberta, we're doing solar deals in the 40s. Okay, in other parts of the world, it's $20 per megawatt hour. Brett called me out on this slide, so I'll preempt him that I ended this in 2020 because I made it a while ago. It's still declining, although there was an uptick when interest rates went up, but still we're around those low levels. Wind, similarly, you're seeing that dramatic fall where now the cost of these facilities is very competitive with alternatives. But cost isn't the only thing. We need to think about value, and that's where there is a con that we need to recognize with renewables. The one that gets pointed out to me quite often is that sun doesn't shine all the time and the wind doesn't blow all the time. And this is true. And so there is a lot of variability when it comes to wind and solar. Solar is more predictable. Here you see this is wind generation for a random day in Alberta. These are real data. It was April 1st, but it wasn't meant to be a joke. You see wind is down near around 0 middle of the day that day, up to over 1,500 megawatts a few hours later. That's a lot for a system like Alberta to have to manage that swing. So managing that intermittency is a real challenge. There's other things, low energy density when you think about land mass needed per megawatt hour of production. And then there's other really technical things when it comes to electricity systems that we need to balance supply and demand every hour. So things like inertia, frequency response that you simply don't get with wind and solar. There's technologies to resolve that, but that's something you need to integrate into your costs. So the reality, when I think about renewables, I don't fear them, but I don't rah-rah them. Chiefly, I think you want to say you're not going to run an entire system solely on wind and solar. Okay, so proponents that are pushing for that we can go entirely that way, that's a stretch. But that doesn't mean that wind and solar are of no value. Okay, just because it might not be there 100% of the time doesn't mean that it provides value. What they do is they displace costly fuel when they're running. Okay, so you get those savings. They're a cheap source of energy. So you want to think about how can I exploit this cheap source of energy. They provide very little capacity, so we need to look for other capacity alternatives. New technologies can resolve those technical challenges I talked about. Things like grid forming inverters, power electronics. There's lots of resource, virtual inertia. There's resources on the grid that we're capable of. Texas went ahead of the curve when they saw wind and solar coming, ensured that all of their resources had grid forming inverters. Alberta did not, and now we're playing catch up in our system in Alberta. Most importantly, they work as part of a system. Okay, thankfully we don't have, my house doesn't have a power plant, and that's the only thing I rely on. As a province, we rely on a system, and to the extent we have connections with our neighboring provinces, that's also part of our portfolio. So the key is finding the right complements to take advantage of this cheap source of energy. And that's where I was going to finish up the talk with discussion on these 4 methods of integrating renewables. So flexible supply, storage, transmission, and flexible demand. And this is my nod to some of my research that I do at the University of Calgary. So I'll showcase some field experiments that we're running. So first is on the firm supply. So here's about filling the valleys when we don't have the wind and solar production. Okay, so dealing with the fact that yes, renewables are cheap, but they are intermittent or variable. How can you fill that? So supply side solutions, reservoir hydro is obviously a wonderful solution if you have it. Constructing new ones is unlikely. Okay, that's very challenging. Nuclear is a possibility, but nuclear is not something that loves to be flexible. So it's not exactly something that likes filling the valleys. It can change sort of your baseline. Of course, the challenge with nuclear, as you know here, is lead time and cost at this current stage, but lead time to produce it. So it's not something that we can implement right away. Hydrogen turbines, so retrofitting natural gas peaking plants to run off of hydrogen. It's a really costly option, but if you're running it infrequently, that's a possibility. I've written papers on the potential role of hydrogen as a peaking resource. Natural gas with carbon capture and sequestration. This is one that is touted in places like Alberta where we have cheap natural gas. The reality of that, first, there's technical challenges, but cost challenges as well. And a natural gas with combined with carbon capture is a high capital cost. You really don't want to be running that infrequently. Okay, so you're looking for options that actually have high operating costs but low capital costs. And it's kind of the reverse with that one. And then geothermal is a solution, but again, flexibility is a question mark there, although some enhanced geothermal, like closed loop systems, potentially have built-in storage. Storage. So storage is that direct solution to manage intermittency. We've got batteries, pumped hydro, compressed air energy storage is something that's plausible here in the prairies. There was a project that I was looking at with them at Lloydminster that was looking to bridge both grids. Hydrogen can act as a storage medium itself if it's going to be used. The real issue for Canada when it comes to storage is seasonal storage. That's the really hard nut to crack. We've resolved moving power from the middle of the day sun to the evening ramp, but moving power from summer to winter is a much harder challenge to do. Transmission. So here we want to leverage the complementarity of different supply mixes. So for example, British Columbia's hydro and Alberta's wind and solar. or even what you're looking at, a future Saskatchewan with large baseload nuclear plants, less flexible with the flexibility of Manitoba Hydro's reservoir hydro. So, and you also get to diversify these weather-dependent portfolios. So we've seen that over the past few years with British Columbia's drought. They're being tied into the US all the way down to California, as well as Alberta was beneficial to them. This is something that's very challenging. The provinces guard their electricity systems fiercely, and interacting with them, linking up east-west, has been a historical challenge for lots of good reasons. The market to the south is more robust. It's a bit easier to transact with. It's larger. When you go east-west, we're bridging very different market structures. So here you have a vertically integrated, traditionally regulated utility, and Alberta has a wholesale competitive electricity market with prices changing every hour. So bridging that can be very challenging. There's also, of course, the standard challenges of permitting linear infrastructure, provincial politics. I think we'll come back to this in the question period, but this is an area where I have tremendous optimism. One of my major projects right now, working with two fellows in the back there as well as others, is working on developing interprovincial transmission in Canada. It seems like there's a lot of stars aligning for this to be a real possibility, despite all of the setbacks for decades on that. That was just a slide showing Canada trades twice as much power with the US as we do across provinces. So lots of scope for changes there. The last one is on flexible demand, and I'll wrap up after this. This is my core area of academic research is on flexible demand. And I really like this quote. It says, if the old world was forecasting demand and dispatching supply, the new world involves forecasting supply and dispatching demand. More variability, more nature-dependent resources, and more ability to control demand and shift demand. So we have more need for that flexibility. We have bigger flexible loads. Electric vehicles are a really good example. And we have really cheap control technology. So some field experiments that I've been running with utilities. This one was with BC Hydro. It was residential customers, about 2,000 customers, where we had peak events. So 3-hour events where we asked people to conserve. Some people would get a notification. They would earn money for these reductions, so anywhere between $1 and $6 per event. We'd run roughly one event every week or two. The manual group would just get a notification that there was an event coming up, and they had to scramble to do something about it. And we saw about a 5% reduction, so something from these folks. The tech-enabled group, we actually installed load controllers for them. So on their devices, this was their heating system, their electric vehicles, their hot water tanks. They would get this notification, they could push a button on there saying, control my devices. So lower my set point on my heating, my hot water, don't charge my EV for the next 3 hours. We actually saw no change from those folks. Okay, so we made it easier for them, but we saw no improvement. And that was actually the path that the utility wanted to go down because they believed this was going to help and it wasn't going to be intrusive. And then another path, we called it central, as in centrally controlled. You can think of this, if you want a better name, automated, where we sent that notification and say, we will dim those devices. We will change your set point. We will stop your charging. You can override it. You can press this button to override that. But there we got about a 27% reduction. Okay, so almost a 6 times increase, really just by making it easy. Okay, it had nothing to do, in that case, easy as in not having to have any human interaction. We saw the same level of attrition from those folks. We saw less than 1% opt-out or override. And everyone in that group ended up signing up for the program that's now a full-time program in that utility afterwards. Some devices are more flexible than others. So I think when you're going for a whole home flexible demand response, it's not necessary because there's certain devices that are much more flexible. So this was a time of use study that I did with the local utility in Calgary, ENMAX. We gave people a 3.5 cent per kilowatt hour discount to charge overnight. Pretty small discount. And we saw over 80% of charging shift to the off-peak. Okay, so a really big shift. I can't quite see the line there, but there was another line where we just gave people information saying, it'd be really swell if you shifted to off-peak because it's really hard for the grid. So moral suasion, but no money, no change. No money, no change. So 3.5 cents. So dramatic change. And if there's any economists in the room, the price elasticity of demand was about minus 1.6. Okay, so a 10% reduction led to a 10% increase in price led to a 16% change in demand. Whereas typically you get an order of magnitude less than that. Typically, price elasticity of demand for electricity is really inflexible. The last thing I have is that maybe it's almost too flexible. This was a recent study. I really like this one with another distribution utility where we looked more closely. So it's good for the bulk system to shift to off-peak. But when we gave them a time of use rate in areas where we had lots of electric vehicles, they were all very willing to shift. But there's such big loads, and when they all were willing to shift, and now they have a coordinating time of the cheap block starts at 11 p.m., everybody shifted to 11 p.m., and it's like that story of people flushing the toilet all at the same time at halftime, or starting the tea kettle maybe is a more appropriate one in England. We now overload the secondary transformers on the distribution network. So while we have lots of spare capacity in the bulk system, the generation system, we actually led to an increase in overloading of the distribution network and accelerated replacement of distribution transformers, which is, to be frank, that's where the bottleneck is for electrification right now. It's not so much the bulk system, it's at the distribution level. So this is one where TOU, well intended by the utility, actually leads to accelerated and increased costs. There's solutions. We did a managed charging trial on these folks where we actually asked people for, they would set a time when they wanted to depart in the morning, and then we would sequence so that the overlap of multiple EVs charging at the same time in the same local area was capped at 2 at a time. Okay, and we found that we could charge everybody and we could sequence things, spreading the peanut butter across toast. So in conclusion, Canada is well positioned for the age of electricity, in part because we have that great starting point of mostly clean. We have strong institutions in Canada and strong capability when it comes to electricity systems. We do have big provincial differences, but I hope that we can turn those provincial differences into opportunities, and east-west transmission presents as a clear opportunity for Canada right now, especially across the 4 western provinces. North American trends are not global trends. So if you took anything away from this today, it's me hounding you that China is doing some things quite differently and quite dramatically. And it's really only been in the past few years, really post-COVID, that that's really accelerated. Solar plus batteries will be king globally, but Canada's mix will undoubtedly be different for reasonable reasons. That's it. Oh, okay.
Asked Dr. Brett Dolter to join Blake and myself at the front, and we're going to host some follow-up reflections and questions and open it up to the audience after Dr. Dolter and I explore this a bit deeper. So Dr. Brett Dolter is an associate professor at the Department of Economics, University of Regina, and he focuses on modeling the costs and consequences of climate and energy policy. So please join me in welcoming Brett.
So in Saskatchewan, we haven't electrified to a great extent. Some of that is understandable. We've got a colder climate, long distances, but we've also had a few own goals, I might call them, in terms of why we haven't been able to take advantage of electrification as much. And the one that really comes to mind, about 12 years ago, SaskPower had some smart meters installed in the province. They were subject to leakage. They're getting water in them. They would short out. There's 8 fires started. So that when they had 8 fires of these smart meters, they had to rip out 100,000 of them. So that set us back probably a decade in terms of rolling out these smart meters. And the smart meters are the things that let you, as a utility, see when people are using electricity. So I'm just wondering, can you talk about how important that technology is in terms of allowing the kinds of things you're testing? You want to know when people are using electricity. You want to control their charging. How important are those smart meters to facilitate that?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, you want to be on a path towards smart meters, so you can take advantage of the fact that the cost of electricity changes dramatically at different times of the day, and you can pass that through to consumers and encourage them. Those pilots I showed you, BC had smart meters, so it's using that. But the ones in Alberta, we don't have smart meters in Alberta. We're getting there. We're adding them, but I think some of our distribution utilities, I think it's 2034 is when it's going to be fully rolled out. So they're not in a huge rush. And we were able to do that in large part because a lot of these modern appliances, especially electric vehicles, where it's really meaningful, have telemetry. So like I have an electric vehicle, I can speak to it from my phone. I can control its charging from my phone, and I can monitor all the charging there. Other devices, heat pumps nowadays too. So you can do these bypass, and the UK actually does this in their demand flexibility service, because not everywhere in the UK has smart meters, where they will pay you based on telemetry readings. If anybody here is from Measurements Canada, this is verboten. So Measurements Canada requires revenue grade meters for charging you a tariff rate, but you can run programs. So you can run flexibility programs outside that. That's something where the UK has gone and accelerated. I think while it might not hit the whole home, you don't really need to. There's some devices, like I was trying to show, that really if you're covering off the people with EVs as a starting point, that's the lion's share of flexibility right now in a home that has an EV.
Yeah. Okay. So good to have, but we might be able to get around it in some ways.
You can get around. I think ultimately you want to get there, but it doesn't need to be the we can't do anything yet. And Alberta is actually going through a proceeding right now on time varying rates and demand flexibility. And yeah, one of the starting points was like, should we even be bothering talking because we can't get anywhere with this yet? And they recognize, no, there's possibilities to do things even before you have the smart meters.
Well, and if you bring up the rates, it looked as if the rates weren't actually necessarily the thing driving. If you're just able to just automate, that seems more important.
That is exactly right. So the thing is, money did matter, but sending that price signal wasn't really the thing that gets people over the hump. It was making it easy. Yeah, it was automating.
So that's on the electrification, and just on the clean electricity front. So about a year and a bit ago, looked like we're going to be building a lot more wind and solar in Saskatchewan, a lot of gas plants. That's been delayed or changed now that we've said we're going to extend the life of coal plants. Now there's discussion of building nuclear, either small or large. I'm wondering, either one of those, transmission could play a facilitating role. And I'm wondering, what is it that transmission could offer, no matter what your generation future, your generation scenario, but
Okay, Stephen?
Okay. Yeah, so transmission is one that it wins in either of those scenarios. So if you've got a wind and solar dominant system, you want transmission to manage its variability to fill the gaps. If you're going for a coal and nuclear future that's largely going to be inflexible, you're still going to have variability on the demand side unless you cover that off with a lot of demand flexibility. So you also want egress for your big baseload. I mean, if you're talking, I know in Saskatchewan's recent strategy, now considering like large nuclear is on the table. Large nuclear, at a minimum, you're talking 1,000 megawatts. And economies of scale, you typically want to twin that in a system that's, I think you're about 4,000 megawatt peak here, roughly. So you're not doing that without transmission. It's not happening without larger connections. And I did see that in the energy security document. There's a recognition of that you need outlets, one for selling surplus, but two for managing contingencies. When you have a 1,000 megawatt plant go down in a 4,000 megawatt system, you need connections to keep system support up. Alberta wants transmission for that same reason. It's not because of the growth of wind and solar, which our government isn't too fond of right now, so that's tapering off. It's because there's a big push for large nuclear. In our case, the large nuclear, they're looking at 4,000 megawatt plants. Our system is about 12,000 megawatts. Again, we recognize that won't happen. It can't happen without bigger connections to our neighbors.
I'm going to combine a couple questions that we've had pre-event, plus from the audience, with a question I have on your slide. So I was keeping a scorecard for Saskatchewan and my knowledge of what goes on here. And on your clean, firm, flexible supply list, there was very few that I could check that Saskatchewan has. Geothermal maybe hit the list here. Natural gas with CCS, we do not have. We have coal with CCS, hydrogen, etc. I couldn't click any of those. Potentially, we have nuclear coming up. And in the batteries and storage, I, again, had a very hard time clicking anything because we're very flat here and we can't store hydro. And we seem to have hit all the transmission challenges. So we've got a few questions from the floor and a pre-event question talking to how you can speak to us qualifying in the clean, firm, flexible supply and in the storage area in relation to this without nuclear and how that investment in Saskatchewan might happen.
Yeah. So one thing I'd say is even down a path of dominant nuclear, you're still going to need flexibility, because if you're building nuclear, which tends to be less flexible, you're still going to need flexibility. It's just coming at it from a different way. Rather than inflexible and intermittent renewables, you're going to have flat but inflexible nuclear power. So you're still going to need something to combine that with. And you're absolutely right. A lot of the solutions, this is why it's important to look at your resource mix if they don't apply. I think on the battery side, first of all, batteries, anyone can do lithium ion, you can place that here. Compressed air energy storage has potential here, salt caverns. So that's one that has potential. Demand flexibility, again, that's something that's possible anywhere. I think that takes a concerted effort by the utility for putting in programs, for having the right rate structure to support it, to incentivize it. To me, the biggest opportunity when it comes to flexibility is transmission. It is that one, though, that, you know, I can tell this story. My dad was an energy economist. It's sort of like a plumbing business. It runs in the family, father and son. And he testified at the Canadian Senate in like 1982 on the Western power grid. And at the time, they were looking at building a large 500 kV DC line from northern Manitoba to Saskatchewan into Alberta. It didn't happen. Western Power Grid never happened. They were thinking of having a coupled system operator. And yet here we are, like almost 50 years later, and I'm still beating that drum. I do think this time it's different. I know that sounds naive to say this time it's different, but I do think there's a lot of reasons why we might be able to overcome that thing that hasn't happened. I think a big part of it is there's more need for it now than there ever has been in the past. But you do have this, and hopefully it's just short term, this threat to our sovereignty, where you have this push to try to do things a little bit. I'm trying to ride that momentum. So I think there's tremendous, and I'm working with all 4 Western provinces right now, and I'm seeing a level of cooperation that I've never seen before. And I've been doing that type of work for about 10 years now, and we've come close on a few deals, and it's never gone to fruition. There's always a battle. The level of cooperation seems higher. The level of interest seems higher. I'm hopeful. I'm remaining optimistic.
Okay, and so I hear you correctly. The transmission you see as flexible, but the nuclear you see as the firm baseload that's required to be clean.
It doesn't have to. I'm just simply saying that if you're going with a nuclear system, you're going to need flexibility too, just like if you're going with a renewables dominated system. Basically, in both cases, supply won't match demand, but there'll be different shapes.
Okay, so we have an audience question. I'll go with one first. In your view, what does ethical leadership look like in a time when communities are calling for deeper relational governance and more collaboration in the energy sector?
That's a deep question.
For an economist.
Yeah, for an economist. Well, I'll take a few angle shots at that. One is what we've seen go wrong in Canadian energy policy, where you have, say, a national jurisdiction or federal jurisdiction push too aggressively down and not reflect local, as in provincial realities. So we've seen that backfire. I think at the provincial level, recognizing community involvement. I mean, the project I'm on, I happen to have Cole Sayers is in the background in the back there with me. One area where we're looking at is trying to have Indigenous on the transmission front, make it truly Indigenous led. So not just Indigenous participatory, like we're moving towards with BC's North Coast Transmission Line and Hydro One having up to 50% or 51% equity participation, but in a reactive sense, trying to allow it to be community led and in that case, Indigenous led, and then be the proponents and then reach out to the utilities and look for partnerships. So flipping that in reverse. I think that's one area where we've definitely faltered on the electricity front over the past decades. And that's one where there's lots of scope for change, but there's also a reality that there's a lot of capacity building that's required on that front too. So it's a big ask to say to a small community, take a 51% stake in this $5 billion project. So it requires a lot of support to get in there and do that.
Okay, and just to follow up on that question. So in your energy marketing days, how do you compare the economic prospects of a cross-Canada grid that would allow some sales back and forth through the provinces versus the potential for the 650 megawatt down into the southern United States and potential sales into California?
Right. Okay, so big part of my career, I was at PowerX, which is the trading arm of BC Hydro. and PowerX, we know full well the value of that trade with California. It's a significant contributor. The way I see it right now is you've got Saskatchewan upgrading their intertie with the US from up to, I think, 650 megawatts by next year. Manitoba looking at increases. Alberta is probably going to increase its connection with Montana as a result. You've probably seen on the news, there's been complaints, international complaints from even the Trump administration on that line. So I'm expecting the fallout of that will be some settlement that actually leads to an increase from that. BC is looking at potential increases of its intertie with the United States, even in this era of sovereignty. The reality is each of those individual provinces aren't going to be able to maximize those lines on their own. And so Saskatchewan, that 650 megawatt line is going to be grossly underused in the near term. Once you build large nuclear down the road, perhaps you're in a different situation. But in the near term, the strength of that East-West collaboration is like building a bit of a fortress in Western Canada of being able to use the resources across all four to maximize expanded lines with the US. Even BC, which probably has the most flexible and largest capacity right now to maximize value with the US, can't manage the potential increase they're looking at with the US. You know, with the growth of electricity that they're facing, growth of electricity demand they're facing in that province, they know that the only way to maximize value of the US intertie is to have more connection with Alberta.
Back to our ethical leadership. So with our Indigenous colleagues, are they part of the bigger discussion about benefiting from the profitable relationship of going south instead of going west, young person?
Go west, young. I mean, there's different models of involvement. I mean, typical model has more been project specific, right? So you're talking about equity participation in a project. If you're talking about a trading utility, that's a very different thing.
Okay, I would like to open it to questions from the floor. I still do have questions coming in online. Yes, over to our Dean of Engineering.
Maybe I should speak like classroom voice. I try to yell. Okay. I have two questions about the transmissions. Given our geography here in Canada, would we consider to use direct current, high voltage direct current for transmission rather than using alternating currents? Currently, that's what we're using. This is the first question. The second one that you mentioned about in 5 years that China will be 100% EV. And the reason that they can produce so much electricity because like the western part of the China, right, is denser. So they have a lot of solar panels there. I'm not sure like that's land cost for it, right, from an economic point of view. So I'm not sure whether we can do the same thing here in Canada in terms of the land, right, to put this solar. But my question is like if the world really follow this, the electrification really go that way, then we don't need petroleum or oil like the IEA report last year saying that they predict that by 2030, the demand for oil will be peak because of the electrification. So with that, so should we build pipeline anymore? Because like people don't need the oil anymore, right? So that's back to the questions.
You get me in trouble in my home province, Dean. So a couple things on that. First, I can tackle the quick AC/DC question. Alberta has some DC lines, some 500 kV DC lines running from the oil sands down. It is a potential, long distance has the benefits. I know that Sask Power and Manitoba Hydro did a study a few years ago of potential linkage, and that was in the mix. It didn't stand out as necessarily a giant improvement. They're just trade-offs. If I think about BC, Alberta looking at new lines, DC provides the benefits of control. So I think of DC as like more like a pipeline. You can control what goes in, what goes out, and AC more like a waterbed. You push and it just comes out somewhere else. You don't really have control over that. AC has the benefit, I think, if we're talking about large nuclear generation and contingencies, so tripping, AC is beneficial because the power just flows instantaneously, whereas a DC would require control. Long-winded answer to say, I think both are in the running. The long distance, if we're truly talking about really long distance, DC has some advantages. On the electrification front, trying to remember the question, on the gasoline, so I do think gasoline, if you look at gasoline demand, it's starting to decline. So not oil, but if we go for gasoline and that part of the barrel, we're going to see some rapid declines in gasoline demand, in large part because China's declining. We're seeing Europe decline in terms of needs. But you're also seeing really big growth in other parts of the barrel needed for like petrochemical. So what I think is going to be interesting, and this actually could be a winning situation for Canada, in that our heavy oil is well situated to produce the types of products, the types of petroleum products that are actually going to be more in demand, even as we electrify transportation. You wouldn't want to be long gasoline in the future. I think gasoline is on its death trajectory, but that doesn't necessarily mean oil is going to fall as quickly because of those other components. The challenge is going to be what the cost does when you have one part of the barrel very under demand. You're going to have to raise the price on the rest of the barrel to make the whole refinery process competitive. So I think that's going to be something. It doesn't get discussed enough, but that breakdown in the barrel is going to be interesting. In terms of supply, you're saying, yeah, the Gobi Desert and whatnot can be blanketed with solar. Need that for all the EVs. I did one thing in Alberta. I'm trying to remember the numbers off the top of my head, but it was roughly, if we added 1 million electric vehicles, and I think Alberta has about 3 million cars, maybe 3 or 4 million cars. So 25% of the stock, which takes a while, even if you're going. It would take the equivalent of one large gas plant in energy. That's nothing. It would take the equivalent of about 1,100 megawatts of wind power running at its typical capacity factors, which we build in less than a year. So energy-wise, it's actually a small quantum. It's surprising. It's because these things are so darn efficient. The challenge with EVs is the capacity, and it's that issue of if everybody tries to charge at 6 p.m., and that really gets into that. That's why my research is all in that, like, what if we try to make people so they don't charge all at 6 p.m. and then also spread them out? But it's more of a capacity challenge. The energy challenge is surprisingly low for EVs. It surprised me.
I'm sorry, did you mention Saskatchewan and Alberta are not AC? They're not joined, their grids? And so there will be an actual DC-AC issue that your project will have to address.
They are AC grids, but there's a DC connection between the two of them. So they're asynchronous. Think of them as two machines. Like you have the West is one machine oscillating at 60 hertz like this, and the East also oscillating at 60 hertz, but not in sync. So there's a DC converter, or DC transformer, sorry, at the border, which we're already in works on upgrading the size of that. So they're two AC grids. We just have to expand the size of that DC connection between them.
Which is one of the reasons Saskatchewan has historically traded and been part of the regulatory system with the Midwest system in the United States with no connections to Alberta in a regulatory sense.
Yeah, yeah, they really are two separate machines, and then Texas is its own third machine. Yeah.
Okay, so back to one of the questions from the audience who is talking about Canada having vast forest resources to provide reliable, dispatchable, renewable energy, which is not variable like solar and wind, and having this strategic resource available in the experience of managing forests sustainably for decades. Why don't we move for bioenergy, which can simultaneously provide heat and energy and be BECCS? You know what I'm saying, right?
Mm-hmm.
With bioenergy can make it a negative emission solution for Canada. Do we need to focus on negative emission solutions for Canada? And what are others doing?
Right. So I'll acknowledge I don't spend much focus on bioenergy, biomass energy. I know some parts of the country use that as a resource. It is something that I suppose Canada has the potential for. I think what it really comes down to is cost. You are getting something that provides dispatchable, so you need to recognize that value. And when renewables were expensive, so that sort of thing pencils as an option. But I think what's changed is now it's not in the conversation when you have wind and solar being so cheap. That type of product. When Ontario was building had their green energy plan, was building wind and solar, at one point. I mean, they're still paying for this today, and I think that's why renewables still have such a bad rap. Ontario paid $820 per megawatt hour for solar in the first version of the Green Energy Act. Like I said, Alberta just paid $48. They were paying $140 per megawatt hour for grid scale wind, and Alberta's recent wind call was $37 per megawatt hour. So it's just changed so much. The costs have declined so much that those other things, I immediately put less focus on them just simply because they're just not in the cost running.
Can you comment on, this is a student question, why we don't have more grid scale solar, like large solar installation and projects?
In Sask,
Yes, or anywhere.
that's probably a Brett question. Or that's a government question. I mean, look at Alberta. We have, I wish I knew the number off the top of my head. I think we have 2,000 megawatts of solar from about 10 megawatts 4 years ago. We have a very similar resource to you guys when it comes to solar. Our solar is primarily down in the southeast of our province, really butting up against you. I think a big part of that is market structure. So in Alberta, you can go and apply for a permit and get an interconnection agreement and then sell your power to the grid. You sell your power to the power pool, there's a power price, and you simply get that. You, of course, want to go and try to get a long-term contract to de-risk. But you have all of that. You also have a output-based pricing system or a large emitter carbon pricing system, which placed value on emission reductions. So for the way that works is we don't have a pure carbon tax. We set it basically, effectively it works that a natural gas plant pays $0. And if you're dirtier than a combined cycle plant, so if you're coal or just a simple cycle like a peaker plant, you're going to pay some emissions. If you're cheaper, if you're lower emission, so hydro or wind or solar, you're going to receive credits. And those credits are valuable because you can sell them to the dirtier folks. You can sell them to other sectors like oil sands. So you get those credits. In Sask, I think two things going against it. One, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you don't have an output, you don't have a large emitter pricing system anymore, right?
Well,
you killed it.
It's questionable whether we do or not.
Yeah, it's questionable.
SaskPower still is trying to hold on to that money in case they get the call from the federal government to pay up.
So okay,
but
so there's something. Yeah, there might not be a signal there, but more importantly is you don't have a free and open access. So that's why I think Alberta was, I think over 90% of all renewable growth in Canada in the last 5 years was really Alberta. It's not because we're ideological greenies. It was really because too much laughter there. It's because we have this open market and it's cheap. It's cheap to build this stuff. Couple on the credits that you were getting for the emission reductions, and it just penciled. That's changed. Okay, we've got obviously in Alberta we've had a clamp down on that. Also, credits really tanked in value. They've come back recently. They've tripled in the past 2 months, but that was a big source of value. Whereas here you got to wait. It's the same in BC. You got to wait for a call. You got to wait for SaskPower or BC Hydro or Manitoba Hydro to put out a call for energy or call for supply.
Hey, questions from the audience. We have Dr. Farney.
So simple question, I guess. I'm curious what bond and other capital markets, like, do they differentiate between the parts of this story, between transmission investment or nuclear or sun? Like, is that part of the policy mix?
They do.
What does that look like?
They do, and they do based on risk. So it depends on if you're doing, like, even within transmission, are you a merchant transmission line, which we have a few of, or are you something that's put into a rate base and effectively your return's guaranteed? They do at times depend on the risk profile of the generating type. So if you have something where you have more control over your gen profile, if that's known, the expected value calculation is easier. So like 5 years, I worked at Lehman Brothers and Barclays, and we would price these bonds, and we would really look at like the basically the volatility of cash flows coming out, and so we did price them differently. Renewables, interestingly, despite the fact that the price is going to be uncertain in a market setting, typically go along with long-term contracts. I think over 80% of all renewable development in North America is coupled with a long-term contract of a minimum 15 years, often 20. And so the coupons tend to be lower for those because of that risk reduction that's coming through the contracts, not so much from their generation profile.
Okay, we have a Laurel.
You, to my ears anyway, you kind of gave geothermal short shrift or skipped over it. So there's a few of us here that are well aware that Regina is building a large aquatic center. Many of us here, a few at least, are pretty excited about it. A big component of that is geothermal. somewhat experimental, but listening to engineers and geologists, not so very experimental. They're saying we have the technology because of our oil, et cetera, et cetera. We have the professionals, we have the technology, it works. We have the underground heated aquifers. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I'm glad you called me out on that because I don't mean to give it short shrift. I do think it's got a lot of potential. I think where geothermal is a smaller part of the conversation is simply scale on a global scale. It can't compete with things like solar that can just grow so quickly. But for places like, and especially Saskatchewan, I think it plays a big role. I'm actually an advisor for a company called Ever, which you may have heard of. It's a Canadian geothermal company, which it started from drillers. It started from Cenovus people. People left Cenovus and realized they could use their directional drilling technology that they've developed there through fracking to create large, like multi-kilometer closed loop systems where they're cycling fluid through that. And it's basically a massive heat exchanger. It's another kind of similar company called Fervo in the US. It's got a lot of backing, doing something sort of similar where they're doing directional drilling, but they're actually fracking. So they're actually fracking for heat, but not for oil. That one, both of those are increasing in their competitiveness. When I first did cost analysis forever, they were very disappointed in me because I came back and said, you're not competitive. Your costs are about 2.5 times what grid scale costs need to be to compete. But you should go for non-dilutive grant funding because you're early stage R&D and there's benefits to your growing. There's a valid reason for that type of thing. You should go for remote communities where your competition isn't grid scale wholesale electricity. It's diesel or very expensive things where you can compete. You should also look at places where your steam has value. Theirs is a low level heat, so they can use it for district heating. And that's what they've done. They're in the Yukon, they're in the Netherlands, they're in Yukon for power, they're in the Netherlands and Germany for steam and power. And their cost curve, they are driving down their cost curve. So they've roughly halved their costs over the past 6 years. So I do think it's got a ton of potential. It's not going to be the global dominant thing.
Excellent. There was a question up here.
Yeah, I found it really interesting statistic. 45% of electricity in South Dakota comes from wind.
Mm-hmm.
So that's not exactly here. Apparently it's windier there this year, but still, that's pretty incredible. And the other question I had was that you mentioned stored hydro. So is it possible to use wind and solar and to store that behind the existing hydro dams here? We're about 15%, I think, or in Manitoba. Is that viable?
Yeah. So, first off, your point to the Midwest of the United States is that wind alley. I mean, they have a lot of wind, and again, not exactly like green hotbeds. They're doing that because they've got a good resource. On the storing wind and hydro wind and solar, but behind hydro, two different methods. So one, if you're thinking about BC Hydro, where there's reservoir hydro or Manitoba Hydro, what you're really doing is just simply serving your load, serving your demand with that wind and solar and holding back the water and then running that later. In other places, don't have any in the West. I'm sorry, I don't know Saskatchewan as well, but pumped hydro, we're actually using that electricity to pump water up to the top, an upper reservoir, and then releasing it later.
Sounds like it needs altitude.
It needs an altitude, yeah. There's actually a proposal in Alberta using an old coal mine tailings pond in the Crow's Nest Pass. It's the Tent Mountain pumped hydro facility where they're going to use wind in that region when there's excess wind. It's actually because it's being curtailed in that region. We don't have enough transmission egress. They're going to take it to Tent Mountain, pump water up into that upper reservoir, and then you let the water fall down and you generate power in a later period. So that's sort of direct when you think about it. But the majority in Canada, when I say store it as hydro, is just holding back the water and not using it.
We're vertically challenged in Saskatchewan. That there is a question online, and then I'll take a question in the back about water, and it's specific to the large-scale nuclear. And with the severe droughts that you mentioned, we in Saskatchewan haven't had hydroelectric revenues for a few years here because of this drought. What do we think about this condition and the projection for large nuclear and the need of water?
The need for water. Yeah, no, I think it's valid. I think water as a resource is going to be something that's increasingly challenged going forward. I don't know too much about that. I don't know too much about water scarcity in there, but I think it's certainly something that you have to consider. There's a huge water requirement for large thermal like that. Yeah.
Okay, we have a question at the back. Yes.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more about consumption. I may be wrong, but my assumption is that the investment in China towards renewables is related to like this burgeoning middle class and the need for more electricity. Whereas here, I don't know. There's been such a concentration on like Energy Star and like energy efficient appliances. Are we consuming less, and how does that fit into like, overall our strategy for electrification, I guess?
Yeah, great one. Actually, I had a slide. I took it out like 10 minutes before, showing like China's electricity consumption and North America and Europe. We've been pretty flat for about 25 years. Very, very modest growth in electricity. Not because we're not growing in population, but just simply, like you said, Energy Star. Energy efficiency has really eliminated the gains from just growing the size. The forecasts are, and I'm always leery because we if you look at integrated resource plans or utility plans for demand, they're constantly saying we're going to grow, and then we never do. But the forecasts, again, are that we're going to grow, but this time there's potential reason to take it seriously because of data centers and AI loads. My personal view on that is a lot of the resource plans that you see with the type of growth are clearly overstated. We're not going to get the level of that demand that we're seeing. And these are massive, massive growth. I saw the one for Georgia where they had a growth over 4 years of something like 30%. I'm trying to remember the exact number, but it's just unheard of type growth. That's not going to realize. There's no way we can get through any permitting processes to do that. But I do think it's fair to say that we're going to have an uptick against the recent trend of flat that we've had. It'll depend on regions that are more embracing of that type of load. It's certainly something Alberta is chasing aggressively, that data center load, and we're actually being pretty, if you want, I guess it's successful, if you want, it depends on your point of view. We just signed up 1,200 megawatts. We capped actually 1,200 megawatts of data center load, and it all got taken up. And actually some of the people that were allocated that space are now reselling it at higher values. That tells you how much demand there is for access to our grid. That's 1,200 megawatts. That's a 10% increase in our peak. So I think we will start seeing that uptick. You're right. In China, the big growth has been from the growing middle class, but increasingly in the last 5 years, it's also been a little bit of that EV story is trickling in. But by and large, it's been the economic growth story.
Okay, questions from this audience? I have a question from Marc-Andre Pigeon, who's one of our scholars up at University of Saskatchewan, and you both might want to speak to this one. It says, can you speak to the potential for rooftop solar and net metering type arrangements to scale up electricity production in Saskatchewan and Alberta?
Right. I start in Alberta. I put solar panels on my roof. They're not really economic. They're not really paying off for me. I do a lot of these things to learn. I've got on my panel, I've got a load monitor. I can monitor every circuit in my home right now. This guy I think is interesting. But I put them on. We do have net billing. So when we're accredited, when I'm using electricity, I'm using my own solar power first. To the extent that I'm not using as much as I'm producing, I'm pushing onto the grid and I'm getting a bill credit. The challenge is what those bill credits are. So my bill credit is at the wholesale energy price that's flat. It's not reflective of the time of day when I'm pushing that onto the grid. So even when I'm pushing onto the grid at a peak time, the power price is $1,000, I'm getting the equivalent of about $45 or 4.5 cents per kilowatt hour. So I think that the private economics aren't quite there for us in Alberta. I don't know what it's like in Sask.
Well, yeah, and just in the Saskatchewan context, and Marc-Andre, I think probably hints at this, that we for a time had net metering where we were paying the retail rate for solar.
Yeah.
SaskPower didn't like that because they said we're paying too much.
Yeah.
When they think about the value of solar, they're saying, well, to us, the value is that we're not burning natural gas. It's offsetting gas. So we only really want to pay you the cost of the avoided gas. And part of why it looks confusing, I think, to customers is we have a rate structure that's antiquated. We have really high energy charges, or kilowatt hour charge is about 15 cents a kilowatt hour, and really low fixed charges on our bills. And really that should be flipped, where if we need to have more capacity built on the system, we could be charging people more for adding to that peak, and charge the actual time of use, or the real time price for what people are using on the system. So that per kilowatt hour charge probably should be more like 8 cents a kilowatt hour in Saskatchewan. And this is a challenge, I think, everywhere. We've got to think about rate redesign. Probably we need smart meters to make that work, though.
It helps, yeah, you can get that time varying point. But the split between fixed and variable, actually in places like California, one might argue it's over incentivized rooftop solar because they load all of their fixed costs into the variable, plus a lot of program costs and government related costs, so that their variable rate is at the top tier is like 60 cents per kilowatt hour. So it makes a lot of sense to build solar when and they have net metering, and you can push onto the grid and get 60 cents per kilowatt hour. It's a no-brainer. So they've almost gone to the other extreme. Whereas in Alberta, we just credit you the energy price, which for me right now is about 5 cents.
Well, and I think it's interesting when you think of it, the two factors going to that different rate structure encourages the electrification, because you can then charge an EV for much cheaper than if you're paying 15 cents a kilowatt hour.
Yeah.
I'll ask the Marc-Andre question he didn't ask, but so putting a solar panel on my roof is very individualized, right? And one of our questions was around the 45% of wind in South Dakota. The Dakotas in the northern United States had much greater cooperative movement to build some of these wind installations and solar installations than what has happened in Saskatchewan and Alberta. Like, can you comment, is there an economic advantage at all in Alberta or Saskatchewan to band together to do solar or wind installations?
I don't know. We have had tremendous growth of wind and solar in Alberta. I don't think we have been hampered at all. I think there's tremendous advantage of banding together, whether it's Alberta, Saskatchewan, or all 4 provinces, to manage a portfolio of very different resources we have. So I guess I'm going to come back to that transmission thing yet again, because it's my favorite one. When I talk about this, it's like throwing a rock in a puddle makes a big ripple. Throwing a rock in a big pond, you don't even notice it. And so I think, that's the view of, if you can strain that, it would enable the development of more things like, say, wind and solar here would be more possible. Even nuclear here would be more possible if you had more coordination with all your neighbors.
Oh, so you're seeing a vision, an imagination that this combined grid is actually going to unite some of our localized provincial power production planning.
There you go. Yeah.
Wow. That's chewing off a lot. Okay, we are almost out of time, unless there's some burning question out there. Then I will want to thank today's speakers, both Dr. Shaffer and Dr. Dolter, for sharing their insights. And I think I will hand it over to Danette for the closing.
Thank you. Well, that was excellent. It was so insightful. I was watching hang on. Better do this first. Stephen's gonna give me a heck later. There we go. Can you guys hear me? Okay, I'll get those later. So I was watching our audience and the response, and yeah, you had them totally intrigued. So thank you very much to both Blake and to Brett for sharing your insights, your thoughts, your expertise, and your knowledge, and for making the trip, both of you. I know campus is a long ways away, but I seldom get that way. But thank you very much for being here with us today. Before I conclude the 5th annual Robertson Lecture, I'm pleased to remind you that this lecture was recorded and will be posted on our JSGS website once it's been edited. So we just got to make sure it's nice and clean for you. For more information on upcoming JSGS lectures or to learn more about our academic programs, you can simply go to our www.schoolofpublicpolicy.sk.ca and visit us online and reach out to any one of us. There's a number of us here in the room. Our emails are very easy. It's just our first name dot last name at uregina.ca. So if you're wanting to contact Margot in future. If you enjoyed this presentation, I encourage you to join us on February 25th when we host our second lecture in the State of Canada lecture series, which will look at whether Prime Minister Mark Carney has delivered on key promises 1 year into his term. Details for that lecture can be found on our JSGS events calendar and on our website. Thank you once again to today's speakers, Blake Shaffer, Brett Dolter, and of course, Margot Hurlbert for getting everything pulled together. And to the members, also to the members of our JSGS Robertson Lecture Planning Committee, Keith Comstock, Dr. Jim Farney, Margot, Karen Jaster, who's very silent all the time, but without Karen, I don't know how we would do any of this. So thank you to Karen. And of course, thank you to Stephen, who always keeps us in line, make sure that people can hear us, does the mics, does the IT. Without him, I don't, because I wouldn't have a clue what to do. Give me the PhD, but I wouldn't have a clue what to do with all this. As you can see, we were all kind of fumbling with it. So thank you, Stephen, you're our God. And thank you to the Robertson family for making this event possible. We can never say enough. When we think about the expertise and the knowledge that we're able to bring to you because of the contributions and because of their generous donations to us. So we thank them so much for that. Last but not least, thank you to all of you who joined us here today. We hope you found the conversation relevant and interesting, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you to our speakers.
Thank you.
Thank you.